This drawing, which is for sale, was inspired not only by Samuel Jackson's character Jules in the movie Pulp Fiction, but mostly by a conversation between economist Glenn Loury and linguist professor John McWhorter on a conversation that they were having about the badass mother effer problem in the Black community, especially among young males. In the video, which I've linked down below, they discuss how the badass mother effer mindset might be one of the major reasons why Black Americans are getting killed by police in the United States. Not to mention the number of Black Americans killed by other Black Americans, which in the past few years averages about 2,500, whereas the amount of Black Americans getting killed by police is much less, about 200 to 240, basically 10 times fewer. And considering the dangerously false narrative about unarmed Black Americans being killed by police, that number is even far less, since it averages about 24 or less per year. Yet white Americans are killed by police also, almost double the number of Black Americans that get killed. And for people who insist on using the per capita perspective in order to continue pushing the narrative of Blacks being systematically targeted for execution by police, especially during presidential election years, that's not a good look either. Sure, proportionally by population, more Black Americans are killed by police than white Americans. But then again, considering Black Americans make up about 15% of the population, they are committing close to 50% of the total crimes in the United States, especially when it comes to murders. Because even though more whites kill whites than Blacks kill whites, and vice versa, more Blacks kill Blacks than whites kill Blacks, Black Americans murder almost twice the amount of white Americans as opposed to white Americans murdering Black Americans nowadays. And the numbers are on the FBI's website for any journalists out there who are more concerned with virtue signaling their woke anti-racist bona fides than they are about reporting the actual facts based on data that could save more lives and lessen the needless political and racial divide in this country. I point this all out because these false narratives about victimhood and racial reckoning are probably getting more Black Americans killed than not. And yet, the badass mother effer problem is not just a problem with Black Americans, obviously. It's a problem with white American males too, and God knows with Hispanic American males, which I'm all too familiar with, having grown up in a Cuban family in Miami, Florida during the 1970s and 80s. Not to make this video about me, and much less me speaking on behalf of Latinos, but part of the point of making this video is to talk about how the badass mother effer problem affects all groups of people. Some people have called it a more polite term, toxic masculinity. And there's a word for it in Spanish too. It's called machismo. And that badass mother effing machismo has helped create many dictatorships throughout Latin America, especially in Cuba, where this sadistic, psychopathic, narcissist tyrant by the name of Fidel Castro, who was directly responsible for the imprisonment and execution of hundreds of thousands of Cubans for decades. This prick is still admired and even eulogized by groups like Black Lives Matter. All of human history has plenty of examples of badass males, many who are literally mother effers considering they're having sex with the mothers of their children. And that fascination with badass mother effers translates into the literal meaning of the words. Take again, for example, this walking, talking societal tumor who sired about 11 children with who knows how many mothers, but wasn't the world's greatest dad to any of his biological children, though he appeared to be Hollywood's favorite tyrant. It's not for nothing that his firstborn son, Fidelito, committed suicide. That's the other devastating result of the badass mother effer problem and the machismo ethos for so many Hispanics, and how it plays out among other cultures too. And yet I wonder to what extent we just have to learn to deal with this level of badass mother effing toxic machismo, since it probably won't be going away anytime soon, let alone entirely. Because toxic masculinity seems to be evolutionarily hardwired into most men's physiology. For hundreds of thousands of years, men evolved to hunt and protect their families with deadly violence. Even now in modern cities, at some point most men will need to defend themselves and or the mothers of their children from someone else. And you can't always count on the police, because when seconds count, the police are always minutes away. And sometimes the very threats men need to deal with can be police officers. That's where the badass mother effer problem might be a little more toxic among Black Americans than among Hispanics or white Americans. Because even growing up among guys who thought it was a rite of passage to be arrested at least once in their life, and yes, that was a thing among a lot of the guys that I grew up with in Miami during the cocaine cowboy era of the 1980s, not even the baddest or quite frankly the dumbest of those guys would think of resisting arrest. And when I went through my own wannabe badass mother effer stage by petty shoplifting or selling pot or cocaine in my late teens and early 20s, never did I argue with police whenever I got pulled over, especially if I had a stash of drugs on me. But of all those times I got pulled over by police, and when I was even insulted by most of them, I instinctively knew to keep my mouth shut and to not push back. That got me out of a number of car searches that would have easily landed me in prison. And I don't believe that it was simply white privilege, especially when it was white American cops who knew that I was Hispanic and they still wanted to give me a hard time. You need to pick your battles wisely in life, especially the hill you're willing to die on. That's why more often than not, swallowing your pride can save your life. And arguing with a cop, much less fighting one, is a battle you're never going to win. It's sad to see how many Black Americans have been encouraged to resist arrest in the past few years. There was a whole movement called Resist. People like Vice President Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Maxine Waters outright called for people to resist and even get into other people's faces, especially if they were Trump supporters. There were even defense funds set up by celebrities for the mostly peaceful protesters that helped fuel hundreds of riots throughout dozens of cities during 2020 over the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. Now, given the United States history of slavery and a century of undeniable systemic racism from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, it's no wonder Black Americans, particularly males, are so aggressively defensive to the point of physical violence. I can only imagine the necessity behind Malcolm X's saying, "by any means necessary," back when Martin Luther King's actual peaceful protests were apparently not enough to bring an end to racism on a national level. I'm no sociologist and much less a physicist, but every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And the unconscionable crimes against humanities by whites against blacks was bound to reverberate throughout generations. So it should come as no surprise that younger generations of Black Americans who never lived through slavery or Jim Crow segregation would feel the need to not only avenge their ancestors, but to ensure it would never happen again. But at some point, that level of aggressive defensiveness can be self-defeating and deadly. Too many young Black Americans, mostly males again, are setting themselves up for very avoidable tragedies by assuming everyone who doesn't agree with many false narratives is a racist and that somehow they have a right to commit crimes to settle scores of history and a duty to resist arrest if they're caught. That mentality is getting people killed. And while I know I'm not the only one pointing this out, it bears worth repeating until the problem is as close to an end as possible. But too many career politicians, activists, and media personalities in particular keep these narratives going by profiting from the retributive bloodlust that somehow gets justified with terms like resist, racial reckoning, social justice, anti-racism, and simply being woke. And sadly enough, this is how humanity functions, as does the animal kingdom and even nature itself. The very fabric of all reality is an unstoppable balance between creation and destruction, chaos and order, because everything is made up of matter and energy, which is in a constant state of change due to the perpetual motion of atoms. Hence the paradox, the only constant in life is change. And that change can be very violent, and yet it manifests itself in biological life forms through masculine and feminine traits among animals and especially people. And let's face it, even sex can be violent, especially when it's really good. However, if we can figure out how to put men on the moon, not to mention bring an end to slavery and segregation, we can also bring an end to the needless violence and tribal divides that are glorified in our culture through sports and the arts, and especially through music and movies. Just like millions of people were misled to take the wrong course of action after the death of George Floyd, you can't tell me we can't redirect that same level of energy into a much more constructive and mutually beneficial way for as many people as possible. Maybe we just have to do a better job of being aware that there seems to be a lot more to gain from destruction, since it's so much easier to destroy than it is to construct. And we especially need to do a better job of identifying and stopping the bad faith actors that shamelessly profit from that destruction. And we need to stop calling some of these people badass mother effers. Maybe we should just call them what they are, simply assholes. We need to stop glorifying and elevating criminal behavior like we have done in movies like Pulp Fiction, which are great examples of superb storytelling, but the moral arcs usually fall flat. It's not enough to show that one bad guy like John Travolta's character Vince gets killed, but somehow Samuel Jackson's character manages to get away with murder and ends up being seen as a hero rather than the murderous psychopath people like he's portraying are in real life, all because he's quoting corny passages from the Bible. And it's books like the Bible that have helped forge a lot of the badass mother effer problem we have throughout humanity, beginning with such an angry, vengeful, megalomaniacal God who is perpetually pissed off at his own creation. But then again, the wrath of God in the Bible is really just a reflection of the innate, inescapable violence we're all doomed to experience throughout our lives at one point or another in order to survive. Which is why we have a badass mother effer problem to begin with. Though we can deal with that problem, much like we've learned to deal with cancer and even cure certain forms of it. I think it begins with identifying the problem and learning to put it in its proper perspective. I guess it's okay to be a bad, meaning good mother effer if you're a happily married father to your children, but there's no need to be an asshole, and much less a dead one that won't be around for your kids when they need you most. And that's the moral of this haranguing video essay with a time-lapsed pen and ink drawing that is for sale. So if you're interested, please contact me through the links down below. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell for upcoming videos, and thanks for watching.